Process, honored for 3 consecutive years with the Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Talk Program Series.
The final process from this instrument comes out in a series of graphs which give you a DNA profile.
DNA. It's helped solve thousands of crimes. It's helped free nearly 100 for rapes and murders they didn't commit. But is there another, more dangerous side to DNA databanks? Crime-solving panacea or civil liberties threat? The DNA dispute, up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
It's been nearly 50 years since Crick and Watson discovered the double helix and introduced us to DNA. But it's been in just the last 10 years that DNA has changed the way we investigate and prosecute an entire category of crime. It can be used to clear or convict, and in a new and definitive way. But as we'll see on this edition of Due Process, new forensic science has brought new controversy with it, as Sandy King is here to tell us. Sandy?
Raymond, when it comes to crime-solving, DNA in these last 10 years has proven to be a double-edged sword. In those crimes where DNA evidence exists, it can be the clincher in the prosecution case or the only way to prove innocence for the defense. So no one wants to shut down the DNA labs. The argument comes on how far-reaching their mission should be. The concerns of critics range from privacy issues to what they say may amount to a new high-tech means of racial profiling. But for 2 men we've introduced you to here on Due Process, 2 innocent men who served long years in prison before lab work finally won their release, DNA testing simply spells freedom.
Oh, they know what? You gotta ask somebody back.
Despite his innocence, David Shepard lost nearly 12 years of his life to state prison. The charge was rape. The only evidence, the victim's identification.
I think they wanted somebody, and they found somebody, and that's the bottom line.
And if it hadn't been for DNA testing, he would still be in Yardville, just as Matt Crumity would still be in Trenton. He, too, had been convicted of rape solely on the word of the victim.
For 6 years, I've been telling the same thing. I don't know nothing about it.
And he, too, was cleared by DNA testing, but only after he had lost 6 years to prison.
We did have a victim in this case who testified and very clearly about the incident, and she believed this individual was the one who committed this crime.
And even in the early 90s, that was all it took. But chemistry has radically changed the courtroom, especially when the charge is rape.
I have read about a guy in California, how DNA had helped him get released from prison.
And you thought maybe me?
Yeah, and that's when it dawned on me.
How long ago was that?
That was 8 years ago.
If the case against David Shepard came today, chances are he would never be charged. A DNA test could have cleared him first.
By DNA, it appears that Mr. Cromedy is excluded, so therefore it could be that he was not the individual who committed this crime.
And if his case were today, that exclusion for Matt Crumity could have come before trial instead of 6 years later.
A blood sample, semen, even a few hair roots collected at the scene of the crime will provide the needed information to establish with certainty a link between the sample and the suspect.
It was the O.J. Simpson trial that put DNA as forensic tool on the world's front pages. But even as that drama was unfolding, a new crime-solving tool was being developed. A computerized national data bank designed to store the DNA profiles of convicted violent criminals.
If you get a full, what we call profile of DNA its identity. The kind of numbers that we get in our DNA cases come up to be 1 in quadrillions.
So the FBI data bank came first, and by 1994, New Jersey was gearing up its own DNA lab and its own data bank.
It's absolutely the most useful tool that's been developed in forensic science in the last 100 years, probably since fingerprints.
But while the state's initial legislation back in 1995 provided only for banking the DNA of those convicted of serious sex crimes, by last year there was a new far-reaching statute and a data bank that now includes murder, manslaughter, aggravated assault, and kidnapping, covering both adults and juveniles. And that may be just the beginning. 7 states now require DNA profiles on anyone convicted of any felony.
We will reduce the number of victims, the number of robbers, the number of burglars, and certainly the number of rapists and murderers by expanding the use of DNA.
So law enforcement professionals like New York City's former Commissioner Howard Safir say it's not enough to bank DNA from those who've been convicted of crime.
I would like to see DNA taken from all arrestees. I would like to do it the way they do it in England, with something called a buccal swab.
It is that kind of expansion that has some civil libertarians warning that there could be a sinister side to the growing DNA databanks.
They can abuse that data. The point I'm trying to make is it is a very slippery slope.
That warning, ironically, from one of O.J.'s lawyers, who has used DNA to clear and free dozens who've been wrongly convicted.
For instance, in Great Britain right now, they're not simply looking at the junk DNA for criminal identification. They're looking at markers for hair color, beginning to look at markers for eye color, race.
And the critics contend that with racial profiling too often a part of the process of stops and searches, arrests, and imprisonment, the data banks pose still another potential problem.
The selection of those in the database is already remarkably skewed and biased by the profiling procedures of the police departments around the country. So what you're getting is people who are suspects, you heard that from Howard, arrestees, that is people who are not necessarily committing a crime, but whose data are now in that data bank.
So what's going to happen is you're going to be creating databases of arrestees, people who are presumed innocent, people who may very well be acquitted or have their charges dismissed, nevertheless having their specimens put in these databanks. And they're going to be databases that are disproportionately black, disproportionately Hispanic.
And the concerns don't stop there. One critic has called the DNA databanks a means of genetic frisking that goes far beyond the old fingerprint analogy. Since DNA can also disclose our biological parentage, our susceptibility to some disease, and even some genetic information about the relatives of those in the databanks, there are additional questions being raised about how confidential the files really are, and whether it makes bioethical sense to allow the databanks to be used for purposes beyond law enforcement. Here in New Jersey, for instance, the law allows for undefined purposes of scientific research.
And for some, that raises still another red flag. We met Peter Neufeld in the tape piece. We'll see him again in just a minute with more on his case for tighter controls on DNA databanks. But we'll also meet a Camden County prosecutor who says instead of inhibiting the databanks, we should expand them. And we'll hear from the Hudson County Assemblywoman who's been behind the legislature's expansion statutes. So stay with us.
Well, they do fingerprinting now, isn't it the same? Just a little more advanced.
Sounds like another movement where Big Brother's trying to keep information on people.
DNA databanks are great. Look at all these people that they incarcerated 15 years ago that they are now finding out that they were innocent.
It both works in terms of convicting people as well as it would work in their defense.
That's personal. I don't want my blood or anything in no one's bank.
I don't think they should keep it on a data bank because they're just going to open, it's just going to be like Pandora's box.
You know, they're going to start with the inmates, and then it's going to...
Not a bad idea if it's used as intended, but there's certainly the potential for abuse of anything that collects private information about individuals.
DNA testing has made a difference in thousands of criminal cases, but it has also raised the threat of government overreaching and intrusion. Assemblywoman Joan Quigley helped write the DNA data laws here in New Jersey. Camden County Assistant Prosecutor James Lynch says those laws have given him important new tools for fighting crime. And Peter Neufeld, who's with us from Newark, is an expert on how evidence can help the innocent. But he thinks the DNA data banks could be going too far. Welcome to all of you. Peter, let me start with you. Perhaps everybody doesn't know that you're a splendid lawyer in many areas, but most folks associate you with the work you've done with my friend Barry Scheck on the Innocence Project, where you've used DNA to free over 70 folks from death row, as well as many other people. So you've used DNA affirmatively in the justice system to free people who were wrongfully convicted. So then it's a little bit of a surprise to some when you are critical of what you think of as excessive expansion of DNA data banks. What are the limits and what are your concerns?
You know, Ray, actually we're up to 88 now. We're way past 70. It's the whole notion of, you can have too much of a good thing. Certainly, just from the beginning, we should make it clear that we're certainly in support of the use of DNA aggressively to solve crime, to clear the innocent. It's been a wonderful, wonderful tool. The problem is that a lot of the states and localities now want to go beyond the federal law and have other kinds of DNA databases. So for instance, we think when you compare on the one hand the interests of the state and public safety versus privacy concerns or race discrimination concerns on the other, when it comes to having a database of convicted offenders, I vote with the database of convicted offenders. But when you start moving down that slope and you start saying, well, what about all arrestees? Then you're introducing the whole problem of racial profiling, when we know from our own experiences here in New Jersey.
Peter, let me ask you this. When you say a database of convicted persons, would you include everybody convicted of every kind of offense, or would you still, within the universe of convicted persons, make some distinctions?
I think that's a policy decision. My own preference would be for violent crimes. I don't have a problem including assaults and attempted murders as well as rape cases. But if it's the wisdom of the legislature that it should also include perhaps more minor crimes, I'm not going to have as hard a time with that, because by the fact that you've been convicted, you've already given up certain constitutional rights and that balancing of interest. My problem is arrestees. My problem are dragnets. One of the biggest problems we're having right now, Ray, is that let's say you have a serial rapist. Police don't know who it is. They can't get a hit on the convicted offender database. So they go out and they ask people to give samples consensually. And for instance, in Florida, they had 2,300 black men consent to giving samples. They were all excluded, and they eventually caught the real bad guy. But do you think that Florida destroyed those samples of the 2,300 men? No. They retained them, and they created what we call a local database, a database of usual suspects. And those people weren't even arrested, much less convicted of a crime, but their DNA profiles will remain in this database in perpetuity.
All right, let me stop you just there for a minute. Let's talk about that kind of expansion of a database, which would go beyond the current law in New Jersey. Is that something you would favor? Like the example, I think Peter was drawing on something that happened in New York fairly recently.
Where a person is voluntarily given a sample, I don't see any problem with that sample being kept. Where a person is fingerprinted in conjunction with a criminal investigation, I don't see a problem with that fingerprint being kept for perpetuity.
Would you go beyond convicted persons?
I think any sample which is gathered in the course of an investigation in a proper way should be kept. Let's give an example of someone who is charged and a sample is taken, the sample is neutral, and the person is ultimately acquitted. If the sample has been obtained properly, there's no reason in the world that should not be a part and parcel of the databank.
So then you would cover essentially everybody arrested regardless of the ultimate outcome of their case?
Not necessarily everyone who's arrested. Everyone where an arrest is made and where a sample is derived during the course of a legitimate investigation.
So any person who's arrested and where it was appropriate to take a sample, without regard to the outcome of that matter, you would keep that sample in the database?
That's
Ray,
correct.
can I ask one question?
Go ahead, Peter. Go ahead.
The one question is this. You know, when you take a sample legally from a rape victim or from her husband for elimination purposes, that's legally received by the government. Do you believe that that should stay in the database as well?
Yes, I see no reason for any legitimately gathered sample to be destroyed or discarded.
Okay.
I think that's going a little bit too far. Now, I started this here in New Jersey, and I believe that it works very well in excluding the innocent and pointing fingers toward the guilty. But I think if we're going to take classes of citizens, other than those convicted, we've got to do everybody. You can't say people who are arrested or people who are on this highway or people with green eyes. You have to go take them at birth if you're going to go that far. But don't take different groups.
Okay, let me ask you this, since we could say that you're responsible for the dominoes here, and however far we go, we're going to come back to you. So that why would you be concerned to say either just those convicted or everybody? Why do you make that kind of a distinction?
Because I think we get to a privacy issue once we're talking about testing everybody or taking the analysis of everybody. Now, I realize that when DNA first came into criminal investigation, it was a case in England where several young girls had been raped and murdered. And Jeffries, who was the commandant of Scotland Yard or someplace, had said, we are going to test every male in this area until we come up with the one who did it. And it worked. But that was a small area. We know that DNA can identify people almost positively to 1 in 100 million. We've got many more than 100 million people in this country. Let's not mix them up.
Okay. All right, let me throw out for you, Peter, and then for other guests, a subject that I think is lurking underneath here. It's one of the concerns, and that is racial profiling. I mean, we're accustomed to that as now a major issue in terms of highway stops. We know that race is a controversial factor throughout the criminal justice system because of the overrepresentation of blacks throughout the incarceration system and the justice system. So, Peter, what about the concern some might have is that if you have any population less than everybody, that inevitably the data bank is going to be skewed in favor of containing samples of African Americans and other minorities.
I think there's no question about that, Ray. I mean, we have to also appreciate where DNA testing is going right now. It's getting faster and it's becoming very mobile. It's only a matter of time, Ray, that the police officers who are working the New Jersey Turnpike will be able to keep a kit in the trunk. And they could stop you for a broken taillight or for reckless driving or for exceeding the speed limit, and they could gather a DNA sample from you right on the spot.
Does your concern go beyond perhaps stops on the street to how that might skew the use of the data bank in the process of its use by prosecutors and others?
Well, absolutely, because you said, you know, right now I was making suggestions which go beyond the New Jersey statute. Quite honestly, I wasn't. The New Jersey statute just talks about uploading to the formal national database. There's nothing currently on the books in New Jersey to prevent local prosecutors and police from collecting these dragnet samples that I just described a moment ago, or arrestee samples, and although they can't lift them up to the national data bank, they could keep a local or statewide data bank and collect samples that are disproportionately black or Hispanic.
Assemblywoman, was it your intention, given the fact that you obviously have well thought out limits on how this would develop, that there be the opportunity for local databases
Absolutely
to go?
not.
Okay.
I can't see anyone standing there with a hypo in hand stopping people at a roadblock. That's far beyond what I had in mind.
Okay. All right, let me ask you, Prosecutor Lynch, obviously you have strong views on overall strategy in law enforcement, but you also are sensitive to this question of race. And given the fact that any database that at least starts with arrestees or convicted persons, the numbers have to be disproportionately black and minority as the system is now functioning. Why wouldn't that create a skewed sample effectively that is going to raise doubts about the fairness of the data bank and undermine confidence in the justice system?
Well, I think when you start using the term profiling, that you're really throwing into the mix something which is inappropriately added to the mix. Profiling in a classic sense in New Jersey, as it's been described, is the stopping of people during drug interdiction programs. We're not talking about drug interdiction with respect to DNA. What we're primarily talking about is crimes of violence, crimes of sexual assault, crimes of aggravated assault, crimes of homicide, kidnapping, that type of very serious personal offense.
But does anybody doubt that we're moving in the direction, that is, we're not going to restrict whatever's been done already, and there are some states that are growing even more rapidly than New Jersey, and that sooner or later there are going to be more comprehensive databases than exist now, and that the profiling idea originally was a law enforcement idea that the DEA used in developing what a drug dealer might look like. What's to prevent the development of profiles of what criminals in various categories look like using the DNA data banks, which at least at the beginning are going to be skewed in favor of minorities?
I think the key is this. When you're talking about profiling, you're talking about the system operating in an unfair and biased manner.
Right.
When you're talking about the use of DNA evidence, you're talking about the system working properly. There are two goals, obviously. I don't know a single prosecutor in my experience that has any interest or desire to convict an innocent person. By the same token, we have a duty and a responsibility to pursue the guilty. I don't know of cases where DNA has been used on behalf of prosecutors in an appropriate fashion where injustice has occurred.
Peter, perhaps as an experiment, because normally before we embark on these huge databases, we like to work with smaller control groups. Maybe we should start with simply a database of all the DNA profiles of the prosecutors in the state of New Jersey or the legislators in the state of New Jersey, see how they like it, see if they have any privacy concerns. And if that works smoothly, perhaps we can go on to other groups.
Now, let me raise a question for you. Let me raise a question for you. The Armed Forces now has a DNA data bank. It's used only at this point to identify the remains of people missing in action. What happens if there's a rape or sexual assault or murder on an Army base? Will prosecutors be able to use that DNA database?
Jim Lynch?
I would certainly hope so. I would hope that we all in this society have an interest in seeing the laws enforced, have an interest in protecting the rights of victims.
Now, you volunteered for Peter's hypothetical
Yes, I did.
But as I recall, the police in the United Kingdom and Britain said no, they didn't want to expand it and they didn't want to be a part of it themselves. So
and
law
you know
enforcement
what? There was a good reason for that, too.
What was that, Peter?
Okay.
Go ahead, Peter.
Oh, I'm sorry. The good reason is it's not, people are concerned that it won't simply be used for law enforcement purposes. Particularly these local databases, since there's no state regulation of them, there's nothing to prevent people doing scientific research on them. Perhaps we can find the gene for antisocial behavior. Perhaps we can find that certain racial groups or ethnic groups are more predisposed to this kind of violent behavior
Peter,
than other groups.
You raised the question that forced me to go back to the Assemblywoman. Learning how sensitive and insightful you are on this subject, I'm a little surprised that your statute draws such a broad range of discretion with respect to research. That is, reading your law, it looks like almost any kind of research could be done using this database, which wouldn't follow the rules normally that would accompany the use of a person's DNA for research. Why is it so broad? Why are you not concerned about that?
At the time, I went down to the FBI lab and read their regulations on research. We assumed that would apply to New Jersey. Now, in the 7 years since this has been enacted, new opportunities are developing. Each of those opportunities has a pitfall with it. We may have to go back and look at this. I had no idea until today that there was even the possibility of local law enforcement agencies or anybody else collecting this data. I don't like that.
In fact, in all fairness to the legislature, Ray, when we first talked to people from the states like this legislator, everyone said we just assumed that the states would replicate exactly what the federal standards were. It turns out not to be true. In New York, Florida, Illinois, California, Virginia, they're all doing these dragnet databases now to lesser or greater extents, and they all seem to be racially selective.
Peter, yes or no, do you agree with the majority of Americans who say they wouldn't want a universal database with everybody in it, or not?
Well, I think there shouldn't be a universal database, but actually I can step back a step and say, look, as long as the majority is not in favor of a universal data bank, then anything other than a convicted offender data bank is going to, as you said before, single out certain groups of people, generally the most vulnerable segments of the society, and in this country that means primarily people of color.
Let me ask Jim Lynch about the universal. Majority of people, a little bit surprisingly to me, of Americans do not favor universal data bank. The Assemblywoman has said either keep it convicted or universal. What do you think, and are you surprised that your position as a law enforcement position is at odds with the majority?
I don't think it is. I don't think I said, didn't mean to say certainly, that I'm in favor of a universal database.
No, I know, but you were willing to expand it beyond convicted persons.
Yes.
Given the fact that the Assemblywoman has said, well, if you do that, then maybe you need to be universal.
What I said, and precisely this, we have a tool which is provided to us. To the extent that we get information properly within the law, I see no good reason to discard that information and to hinder ourselves down the road from potentially stopping a crime.
Ray, I think if the crime victims in New Jersey were aware of the fact that he was advocating retaining samples from rape victims and their spouses that are simply used to nail the real perpetrator, but they'd be kept in perpetuity as well, I think a lot of those people would object to that.
I'm down to my last minute, so let me get some predictions. First, to perhaps future Governor Quigley. 2011, we get you back on the show. Will we by that time have or be on the verge of universal data banks for DNA in America?
I think it's very possible.
Peter, what do you think about the future?
I don't know. I think the people in the United States are pretty independent-minded, and they very much care about privacy concerns. And I think that the privacy concerns may be prevailing.
Given that law enforcement generally tries to push for any tool that it thinks will help, what's your prediction as to how far we'll go? Not necessarily what you'd prefer.
Law enforcement respects individual rights, respects privacy rights.
Okay.
I predict that the pool will expand. with relation to criminal cases, people who are charged, people who are convicted. I don't think it's going to go beyond that.
We'll come back in 2011 and see if you're right. Thank you all for joining us. That's it for this edition of Due Process. But we hope you'll join us next week when we take on yet another cutting-edge issue of law and social justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
It's absolutely the most useful tool that's been developed in forensic science in the last 100 years, probably since fingerprints. And not only are the results able to identify the perpetrator of a crime in certain cases, but also it's very important to know that we exonerate quite a few wrongly arrested suspects. And in fact, we periodically look at how many exclusions we've had, and basically our exclusion rate is anywhere between 25 and 30% of the suspects that are submitted to the lab we exclude as being the perpetrator of the crime. So it works both ways.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,